What one mistake do you see private equity firms or their portfolio companies making?
I think to put it more broadly, I think it's probably an important distinction although it dovetails into the conversation around portfolio companies, I think in private equity and venture capital, I think the mistake that I see is just like a hesitation to embrace technology and a hesitation to adopt technology and to use it as something that can create tremendous leverage. There's Hugh MacArthur is a global head of private equity at Bain, and he has a quote that's been widely used at this point, but he says, when I think about the most manual industries, I start with landscaping and quickly move to private equity. And which is a little bit tongue in cheek for sure. But, I think it's interesting because, if you think in financial services is a broad category, but a lot of times you look at hedge funds and groups like that are addressing public markets, and they're some of the most tech-enabled folks in the world, right? Using really bleeding progressive technologies as it relates to data, machine learning, things like that to just be smarter and make better decisions. And if you contrast that with, a lot of the conversations I have with GPs at private equity and venture capital firms, the most important valuable piece of technology at their firm is Microsoft Outlook or Office 365. So they spend a lot of their time in an inbox and a lot of time managing, simple like a list of LPs that's worth $500 million is managed in a spreadsheet. So it's kind of like, wow, this is the world society from a technology adoption perspective has moved a lot, and the industry seems not to have quite kept pace. And I think a lot of it is because some of the incumbents have really gone unchallenged for the last 15, 20 years. Like their place is pretty competitive. And you ask a lot of these firms what their differentiation is, and it's pretty common that they'll say, we have a smart team, we're well networked, and we've got a good track record, right? But if they have to really define something in terms of an investment thesis or the repeatability of their thesis with data, they struggle because there's not a lot of technology involved in what they do. So to put it very simply, I would say that the big mistake I see is that folks try to address issues with human power. It's like we just need to hire more associates versus thinking about how technology and more so data can just give them tremendous leverage that scales up, not necessarily scaling out with headcount.
I think it starts with the definition of digital transformation. What's really, I won't say it's funny, but I think it's a commentary on today. But when most private equity talk about technology, when they talk about digital transformation, they're talking about IT. And, that's fine. And you just did, from your perspective as well. But really, there's such a richer world out there for technology. And again, in particular, talking about how do you create value. So the biggest mistake, I think, is, and I'm not going to call it a mistake because it's really it's an educational process, but it's thinking about technology as being IT. So whether it's a business system, whether it's a BI, you just mentioned it, or it's a CRM or a PLM. And then you move another, I call these kind of the operational layer, and these are really 80s tech, if you think about it. Of course, they've been improved over time, but they're 80s tech. And then we go into automation. So then more sophisticated private equity managers will look and they'll say, okay, well, automation and RPAs, I don't know if you're robotic process automation, I don't know if you're familiar with that, digital marketing, e-commerce. Now that's technology. Yeah, it is. And again, I call that the automation layer, and that's from 20 to 30 years ago. But again, from a value perspective, that's not technology. From a value perspective, it's kind of what I was saying earlier. It's what I call the high technology, not the low tech, not the mid tech, but this is the smart layer. So this is the Internet of Things. It is data science, and data science is broken into analytics and AI, which is really machine learning. You have something called the digital twin. These are all terms that you may have crossed because they're becoming more popularized, but sensors and additive manufacturing, augmented reality, blockchain, these are the technologies that used to be in the venture capital portfolio, that are now have matured. So the number one mistake, we'll call it a mistake, is thinking of technology as IT, maybe thinking of it as automation from a value perspective.
Business development, I think, is something that had historically been tackled by, the principals or partners of a firm, and really wasn't thought of as a, dedicated full-time capacity for many years. And I think that tide really started to shift 5 to 10 years ago. I mean, you would see firms that had a dedicated professional before that, but it's really taken off, particularly within the last few years, and not just having a head of business development and having just one person, but in fact, a whole team of business development professionals, working within one firm. And I think it is really important to be able to have dedicated BD resources. I think that some firms undervalue that function. In today's market, especially in the middle market, which is very vast and opaque. It is hard to find good companies to acquire. The space is getting more and more competitive. So if you have a few people spending 10 to 15% of their time on sourcing, you're really not setting yourself up for success. So to have a real competitive edge in finding the right companies to acquire, I think it's really important to have a dedicated business development effort.
I've been reading as a researcher tons and tons of fund documents, because obviously these are shared with me on a confidential basis to fuel my research. And I always say, I kind of rip them apart in the sense that I take the numerical part and stick them in a database, and I keep the prosa, the description of strategy and all this good stuff, for bedtime reading. And I actually gave up bedtime reading in this regard, because I read that over time, they're all saying the same thing. And they're all saying what they believe or what their placement agents tell them the LPs want to hear. And that makes them undistinguishable. And so if I put myself at the limited partner's perspective, and I do see the market in some capacity also from the LP's eyes, I would read this and say, oh, there's another one of those, another one of those. And they all say the same thing. How do I get any categorization in there? Whom can I trust? And I think that's actually a big mistake of many fund managers. They all not only maybe are similar, but they're trying to look exactly the same. And few of them are actually daring and says, okay, we're different. And we want to be different, and we believe in our strategy, and we believe that this strategy is going to attract $500 million for the next fund, and we're going to go after it. And we have the courage of getting across as different out there in the marketplace.
Believe it or not, there is a global pandemic larger than COVID-19, one that has been around much longer, and it is bias. While bias doesn't directly affect our physical health and doesn't take loved ones from us, bias negatively impacts the health of our culture and our businesses. To be a successful investor over the long term, I believe it is critical to understand common biases that often lead to poor decisions and investment mistakes. Biases, however, are hardwired into our brain. They evolved as an evolutionary advantage to help human beings make decisions quickly. In essence, biases are decision-making shortcuts in our brains. In many ways, they help us get through everyday life. After all, if we would make decisions, everyday decisions and micro decisions in the same way we make investment decisions, we'd never get anything done. In his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Prize winner Danny Kahneman explains that we use two cognitive systems to make decisions. One that's impulsive, automatic thinking, and another one that is responsible for thoughtful, deliberate thinking, which needs to be called into action and purposely activated. What this means for investors is that while many of us think that we use data and critical thinking to make decisions, the truth is that investment decisions are based on how we apply judgment to facts and figures. Judgment is inherently an emotion and therefore subject to biases. Even though we think we're using the second, more intellectually thoughtful cognitive system, oftentimes we're simply rationalizing a decision made by the impulsive system. Understanding these biases, and more importantly, being aware of them, can lead to better decision making, lowering risk, and ultimately improving investment returns over time.